There are few things more complex in this world than reality itself. It may be impossible to ever fully understand it, yet we are subjected to it every second of every day. It quite literally is our entire existence. Defined, reality is the sum of all that is real or existent within a system. But what happens when, in a split second, an event occurs that breaks the rules of that system? The rules that should be unbreakable. What happens when reality glitches?
I am privileged to be here today.
We've seen it happen before with things like the Mandela effect and doppelgangers, and all that's really interesting to me. But there's something that interests me more, and that's the idea that if the reality around us can glitch, maybe so can we. It's an idea that we've touched on before in my Backrooms video. You're going about living your daily life when suddenly the world around you changes until it's not even your world anymore. Glitching out of reality is something that most find to simply be the work of fiction, but on some occasions, these real-world malfunctions may have actually happened, with some stories going past any rational explanation. And James Tedford is about to become our first example.
It's such a comfort to take the bus.
And the man who keeps his eyes closed. Mystery? There's really no mystery.
It was a snowy day in St. Albans, Vermont, in the winter of 1949, as people piled onto the public bus headed for the town of Bennington. On board, the bus was nearly filled with people, with one being a man named James Tedford. It should have been an 8-hour bus ride, and it was one that Tedford had done numerous times before. After a recent stint in World War II, Tedford found himself living in the Bennington Soldiers' Home, which, as you might have guessed, was located in Bennington. But with many of his relatives living in St. Albans, he would frequently make the long trip out to see them. But as the snow began to pile higher and higher that day, the bus ride began to drag, and it was estimated that its route was delayed by hours. As the long day of traveling went on, Tedford found himself dozing off, and by the last stretch of his trip, he had fallen asleep completely. As the bus stopped at the final station before Bennington, Tedford remained in his seat, fast asleep, as the door shut and they headed towards their final stop. The bus would arrive in Bennington shortly after, but Tedford never would. As the bus neared the last stop, some noticed that Tedford was no longer sleeping in his seat. In fact, he was nowhere to be seen. Tedford's luggage was left in the luggage rack, and his bus timetable was still lying open in the seat where he had just been sleeping, yet there was no sign of him. But the issue was that the bus hadn't stopped since the previous station, the station that Tedford was seen on board sleeping soundly through. This is something that all 14 passengers and the bus rider told to authorities. Tedford was still on board that bus when it was heading for its last stop, but when they arrived at that next stop, he was nowhere to be found. So while the bus was moving along its last route of the day, James Tedford had vanished into thin air. But how could it be possible? If the bus hadn't stopped, then there would have been no way for him to possibly leave. James Tedford would never end up coming back to retrieve his belongings, and in fact, no one would ever hear from him after this. And despite an investigation and an extensive search by authorities, the last time that he would ever be seen was sleeping on that bus. It's a disappearance that seems to be completely impossible. How does one disappear from a moving public bus? How can you vanish before someone's eyes? It has caused people to wonder if, perhaps, at some point throughout that last leg of the trip, our world experienced an error. an error that removed Tedford from our reality. It's an improbable occurrence. How can our reality experience a glitch like this? And how can it even glitch in general? Well, there isn't really a concrete answer to this currently, and there likely never will be. But a theory has been proposed that could explain everything. It's a theory called the simulation theory, which explores the idea that we are currently living within a simulation, one that faces malfunctions just like any other simulation would. And yes, I understand how crazy it sounds, but with some background information, it actually might make sense.
Okay, Atari, let's see your best pitch.
Don't just watch television tonight. Play it.
40 years ago, look back and see what our video games used to look like, and now compare them to what we have today. The growth in our computing technology has happened at such an incredibly high rate, and from this point on, technology will only grow more and more. We went from hitting a ball back and forth to simulating our own little worlds within less than 50 years. And on the timeline of our existence, that's such a minuscule bit of time. So assuming that humans will remain living for thousands and thousands of more years, then let's imagine how advanced the technology will become. I mean, at some point, our technology will get so advanced that our computers and games might be able to replicate free will, which means the non-player characters within a game will be so advanced that they can make their own decisions, have emotions, and be able to touch and feel things. This would be the equivalent of them having their own mind and gives them the ability to think for themselves. Once that happens, then the game or simulation is their reality. That's all they would know. So they would have no way of knowing that they are actually just a simulated being, unknowingly living in a world that, on a physical level, doesn't even exist. And with the way our technology has been advancing and is projected to continue to advance, it seems that there's a good chance that this could be possible in the future. But this is where the theory gets a lot deeper. Once we have the ability to create a simulation where the characters truly think they're real, then those sims will start to advance. In that simulation, the idea of a simulated world wouldn't be invented yet, so eventually they would invent it for themselves. And when they do, they would run it and create another simulated world. And then that world would do the same thing, and it would keep going and going and going.
Someone programs a universe, and in there they gain maturity and technology, and then they program a universe, and then they program a universe. So you can have nested, simulated universes all the way down, but there's only one real universe.
And each time that simulation is run, it'll lead to millions of more simulated worlds, all filled with sims who have no idea that their world doesn't physically exist. So basically what I'm saying is that once one of these simulated worlds is created, then it opens the door for billions and billions and trillions of other simulated worlds to come after it. So let's look at that from our perspective. Where does that leave us? Does that make us the one true reality that hasn't created simulations yet? Or are we one of the trillions of simulations that were created after its invention? I mean, it's crazy, but really think about it. If you believe that this level of simulation is going to be possible in the future, that means that the chances of us living in the one true reality right now would be 1 in billions. This is a point that people like Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson have even showed support for in the past.
So given that we're clearly on a trajectory to have games that are indistinguishable from reality, and those games could be played on any set-top box or on a PC or whatever, and there would probably be, billions of such, computers or set-top boxes, it would seem to follow that the odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions.
I mean, not that that proves anything, but they're a lot smarter than I am, and that lends some credibility to this theory. And though this sounds like a wild conspiracy, this actually is a fairly well-researched scientific theory that many scientists are unironically exploring at the moment. Now, truthfully, there is so much more to this topic that it would just take hours and hours to fully explain it, so I'll just leave it at that. But hopefully that at least made some sense, because it seems to be the basis for understanding how these real-world malfunctions could be possible, because every game and every simulation has glitches along the way, and some are worse than others. Some are worse than just the removal of one person. People disappear quite frequently within our world, and though most turn up a short time later, sometimes people really do vanish without a trace. And while it's difficult enough to understand how this could be possible, what is even more confusing are cases of mass disappearances. Cases where rather than just one person vanishing, it's a whole group. It's not something that commonly happens, but when it does, it often defies all logical explanation, with perhaps one of the earliest recorded examples of this being the Roanoke colony. It happened all the way back in 1585, when European settlers established a colony on the island of Roanoke, but almost instantly, the settlement began running into issues. For starters, they failed to ever gain peaceful relations with the Native Americans in the area. Plus, the resources there were not plentiful enough to fully support the colony. Because of this, a supply ship was sent back to Europe to restock and bring goods back to the already struggling colony. When the supply ship left Roanoke in 1587, its captain estimated that they would be back within a year to give fresh goods to the settlers. However, upon the ship's arrival back in Europe, a war broke out, pushing back the ship's return voyage. It wouldn't be until 1590 that the ship would make it back to Roanoke, but there was no one to go back to. They arrived to find the settlement looking perfectly preserved, but totally abandoned. There was no signs of a struggle, and all the settlers' belongings were left behind. The only clue that the settlers left was the word Croatoan, which had been carved into a palisade. This may have been an indication that the settlers had moved to a nearby island by that name, but unfortunately, the supply ship was never able to search that island due to poor weather conditions. There was estimated to have been around 120 settlers living at the outpost at the time, and they all had seemingly vanished into thin air, and none were ever seen again. And despite the immense popularity that this case now has, and the modern technology that has been used to try and figure it out, the mystery has never been solved. Researchers have searched for the remains of the settlers to try and determine if they were attacked by Native Americans, but remains of the settlers were never found in Roanoke, making it almost impossible that they had been killed there by Native Americans. Plus, there was no sign of a struggle, which would have been highly unlikely if the group were actually attacked. Researchers have also searched the area of Croatoan, but again, no remains or even any artifacts were found that could have proved that the Roanoke colony had actually moved there. There are currently companies set up entirely to help in solving this case, yet nothing has come of it. And based off of what I've read, it doesn't appear that they have discovered a single piece of conclusive physical evidence. It's really like this group just dropped off the face of the earth. To this day, there remains dozens of theories to try and explain this event, but no one has pieced it together. With this in mind, many have come to the conclusion that this was another example of a major reality glitch. Maybe some kind of error within our simulation caused the colony to be wiped from existence. And though one might think that something like this could never happen in this day and age, that's actually far from the case.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9, good night.
We're seamlessly connected than ever to every corner of the world.
It's estimated that over 44,000 flights take off and land each day throughout the world, delivering in total roughly 2.7 million passengers. And typically, these flights go off without a hitch, as the vast majority of them make it back safely. And when the passengers boarded Malaysian Flight 370 on March 8th of 2014, they would have had no clue that they were about to become the exception.
Breaking news tonight, a Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board, including 4 Americans, has gone missing.
Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur at 12:41 a.m. and was headed for Beijing. 227 passengers were on board, as well as 12 crew members. As the flight entered Vietnamese airspace, the plane's pilot radioed in to air traffic control with these chilling words. That would be the final message sent out from Flight 370. The plane would go on to disappear, along with all 239 people on board. To this day, neither the plane or its complete wreckage has ever been found. And despite there being many theories on what may have happened, there remains no solid conclusion as to where the plane went. Part of what makes this story so terrifying to me, as well as many others, is how a full-size Boeing airplane could just disappear. With the technology that this world has, I would have never imagined anything like this happening in a million years. And even after this became one of the biggest news stories of the decade, we still have yet to find any real evidence, any proof as to where this plane went. All eyes were on this topic. Everyone was searching for this plane, and yet it never turned up.
34 helicopters, 40 ships, even submarines, desperately looking for clues.
With all the resources that were used to search for it, something would have surely been discovered. And yet here we are years later with nothing but scraps of evidence. Because of this, there are many theories out there that have tried to explain how a plane like this could just vanish. And it's within these countless theories that we find one related to this video. Maybe the plane encountered a reality glitch. A glitch much like James Tedford and the entire Roanoke colony might have faced many years ago. A glitch that removed the plane from our world. Now I'm left with a ton of questions after exploring the world of reality glitches. But one question still burns in my mind. If all this is true, and people and things can really glitch out of our world, then where do they go? Would that person just cease to exist? Or would people survive the glitch and find themselves in some sort of other reality? Perhaps they glitch into an area outside of the map, an area that wouldn't be rendered by the simulation. If it truly wasn't rendered, then maybe the area would just be a void, an endless plane of darkness and nothingness, an area that you would be permanently stuck in, surrounded by nothing, alone for the rest of your eternity, which is a horrifying thought, and for that reason alone, I hope that none of this is true.